for Mongolia, which is an NGO trying to tackle education inequalities in Mongolia through various efforts. And
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Executives, the show where we navigate the intricate world of executive leadership, exploring strategies, insights, and personal stories of successful professionals shaping the global business landscape. I'm your host Majid, and joining us today is Tushig. Tushig is a social entrepreneur and a policy analyst tackling Mongolia's key social and economic challenges. As the co founder and CEO of Teach for Mongolia, he's improving education access and quality. With previous experience at the World Bank, UNDP, and the Mongolian government, he brings a unique blend of finance, policy, and sustainability expertise to drive impact. Let us welcome Tushig. Sai U Tushig, mini podcaster Tavtai Morel.
thank you very much, Majid. That was a perfect little bit of Mongolian.
Now you need to say thank you in Mongolian then.
Баярлалаа намайг подкаст орж оролж байгаад Majid.
Okay, that was very fast, but cool. So you are very experienced, and I try to do justice basically by explaining very shortly, like what are you doing and what have you done in your life so far. But can you tell us more about the listeners, because that's how people actually connect to you, that they want to understand where do you come from and what have you been doing so far.
Sure. So my name is Tushig, as you just said. Tushig is actually the shorter version of my first name. As you mentioned, I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Teach for Mongolia, which is an NGO, independent, non-profit organization that has been operating in Mongolia since 2022. We are trying to tackle education inequalities in Mongolia through various efforts, and we have been doing that for the last few years. But before Teach for Mongolia, I worked for both public and private sectors in Mongolia, specifically focusing on development finance, policy formulation, and strategy for government as well as multilateral organizations.
We do have a really cool topic because education, I realize, is like we have one lot which says education is not important. They give examples of Steve Jobs or the people who dropped out and built billion-dollar businesses. And on the other side, there are other people who say that education is very important. So it's also important we start talking about more and more about education, because I think it still plays a very important part. I mean, if you look at 0.01% that built huge businesses, it's not a good KPI, right?
Hmm.
But before we dive into that, I have a absolutely random question that I have started asking my guests.
Sure.
So it is this time it's a little different. Once I asked about if they won the lottery, what would they do with it? So today I have the question I have for you is, if you had an extra hour every single day, so instead of 24 hours, now you have 25 hours, what would you do with the single hour more?
Oh wow, that's a very interesting question. I've never thought about it. So if I have an extra hour every day, I guess I would spend that to educate myself most of the time. I used to read a lot of the books, but given that I have two children now, reading in a quiet place is has become sort of a luxury when you have a 3 and 8 years old. So I guess if I have an extra time, I would just dedicate that 1 hour for find a peaceful corner of my home and then just read some books.
Yeah, that's cool. By the way, I will tell you what one of my friends did, because he also loves to read. Like he would read at least two, three books before he had kids a week. He was that like he has his own library
Yeah.
with 400-500 books. I think it's a big library for someone like a home library. So he actually like read in front of his kids, and his kids now also like to read. He got them books which were more kids books. I saw the craziest books in his kids library, like quantum computing for a 5-year old or something like that. It's like a small little book or something, AI for kids, but
Very
it teaches them about the new tech happening.
right. It's very advanced for a 5-year old, but I guess it's better to learn those young kids from early on, given this day and age of advanced technology and everything is
Hmm?
developing very fast. So it's never too late, right?
Hmm? No, they're building books for kids. Like it literally, it was for me. It just was like pictures with like the typical children's style book, but it was teaching them something that would be could be a good skill for them in the future. So I was very impressed with it. Yeah.
That's cool.
Maybe I should ask him for the link and send it to you. It was super super cool. I haven't seen it like anywhere. And his kids, like, I normally kids around 4 5, they throw books around, right, or put it in their mouth like typical kids. But his
But
kids knew that when you get a book, you open it up and you go from left to right.
exactly. So, I mean, even today, I mean, without reading books, you are able to. I am able to get a lot of information, right? Whether listening to podcasts, listening to a different speaker notes, or different conferences, and etc. I think what technology allowed us to do is just obtain and digest information so fast, and I think that's a great way to also absorb information.
This is very true, very true. Now we are sitting because we want to talk about shaping Mongolia's future, the transformative impact of Teach for Mongolia on education and development. Um, we met at the World Economic Forum, and I realized that Mongolia is also like trying to do a lot of stuff, like in general economic development. Also, then I met you, and then I realized that you're also pushing in education, which is super good. So let's start with the ground zero, like literally ground zero. If you explained a little bit about what is Teach for Mongolia, but let's do it once more for people to understand what is Teach for Mongolia really doing.
Sure. So again, Teach for Mongolia is an NGO. It's an effort to build a collaborative leadership, especially among young professionals in Mongolia, who are always sort of worried and concerned about the Mongolian education landscape at the moment. And when you talk about education, it's there are so many different problems as well as so many different challenges. And if you look at them at a grand scheme of things, most of the challenges and opportunities in the countries across the world is pretty similar. It's not only specific to Mongolia. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of qualified teachers in our classroom. And also, when we talk about education, it's often overcrowded and underfunded by the government. So, because of that, the quality of the education, particularly in rural areas of Mongolia, has deteriorated quite significantly over the last decade or so, and that has been evidenced by a number of research and number of studies that rural schools, rural students are actually sometimes, on average, anywhere between 1.5 to 2 year behind those who are studying in the city or city centers or provincial centers. So there is a huge disadvantage. And again, there are a number of factors that are influencing this phenomena. And we think the number one thing is a lack of qualified teachers in our classroom. And so, again, what Teach for Mongolia doing is we are providing a creative and innovative way to solve this problem through a different than a traditional method. And obviously, the traditional method is still happening, but we are doing something in parallel to basically improve education access in Mongolia.
What you mentioned about the problem of teachers, it's also in Germany. It's like it's hard to become like people. Not everyone wants to be a teacher because the economic benefit is very less when they see, for example, that hey, I can make twice more or more money in being a consultant or something. People prefer that because at the end of the day, they also want to live a good life, right? So it's I
Exactly.
think when you look at a country like Germany, even if it's struggling, so with the education sector, I think all of like it is not. It's pretty normal that smaller countries like Pakistan, India, Mongolia, they also struggle a lot, which is good that you are trying to solve the problem, right? And I think like regardless which country, but every country can take a lesson or two from NGOs and institutions like Teach for Mongolia and so on. But what was your inspiration behind this? Like, why did you even start Teach for Mongolia?
As you mentioned before the podcast, I have a banking and finance as well as a policy background. So I don't have an education background. But what I've observed over my career is that, as you mentioned, education is basically at ground zero. And education can be a silver bullet to sort of tackle many challenges that we see in today's society. And without a proper education and without a proper educated citizens, I think for countries like Mongolia, which is a developing nation, the speed of development will be very slow. And then the direction of the development needs to be sort of validated by an educated citizens. And that's something that I have observed over my career. And that's one part. And the other part is I actually myself grew up in a small town of Mongolia, which is about 4 hour, 3 hour drive from Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city of Mongolia. And I myself witnessed what kind of disadvantage I could be in if I actually studied or if I grew up in a small town, rural town. And when I was in the seventh grade, my family actually moved back to Ulaanbaatar, and it was just a completely different environment. The level of education outcome of the students that I was in the classroom with was completely different. They were looking at the different textbooks. They were just completely different level, and I think it's not just me, and it's, unfortunately, that problem is still happening today in Mongolia. If it's, I think it's getting even worse. So there needs to be something that has to be done, and that's why and along with so many different co-founders of Teach for Mongolia, we decided to, hey, why not find a different solution and why not and implement something that is meaningful and impactful. And that's how we sort of came up with the idea of Teach for Mongolia.
That's cool because oftentimes, this is also a question I get multiple times, right? People ask me, like, why do these guys who are like doing NGOs, or why do these guys like who are running startups, like doing the startup? I'm like, yeah, normally it's not something that you wake up in the morning and you're like, you know what, let's do something.
Right.
It's a process. It takes multiple times. You see that, a personal experience, you see something happening again and again and again and again. You end up solving the problem. That's how entrepreneurs are made, right? And when you talk about Teach for Mongolia, it's an NGO, but behind an NGO, I believe there would be some core principles, right? So, what are the core principles of Teach for Mongolia, and how do you ensure long-term sustainability in improving educational access? Because that's also oftentimes people connect two dots, which is I understand them. NGO is equal to cannot sustain.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, just you're going back to the initial question that you asked. It's not something that a lot of our Teach for Mongolia's co-founders just wake up and decide to do. And everybody had an idea of what can we do in terms of improving education, what can we do in terms of improving the youth development in Mongolia, and what can we do in terms of improving the rural development. So it's all these lingering questions that has stuck with them for 10, 15, or 20 years. So, and then eventually the process and thought process goes, and then it comes to this, hey, maybe this could be a solution to all these problems and concerns that we have. And I think very similar to what you just said, that's how sort of Teach for Mongolia was born. In terms of the core principles of Teach for Mongolia, I'd like to say that education space has so many different stakeholders. It's just number of students, their parents, the teachers, the local communities, as well as the government, the Ministry of Education. And if you look at it, it's probably one of the sectors that has probably the largest number of stakeholders. And when you are trying to sort of make an impact in that space, you inherently have to work with so many different stakeholders. So our core principle is we have to do it together, not necessarily just Teach for Mongolia, not necessarily just our fellows or a couple of co-founders. It has to be in a collaborative effort between NGO, businesses, government, as well as local communities, and then teachers as well as parents. So we all have to be on the same page and understand each other and be respectful, and then we develop this a solution or a destination that we wanted to go forward. And then together we have to implement it. So one of the key principles is that how do we keep everyone involved in our operation? So whenever we deploy our fellows in rural communities. We wanted to work with school principals. We wanted to work with the fellow teachers. We also wanted to want to work with parents as well as the community leaders or local officials, so that we all have an idea of what we are trying to do, and then we sort of attack this problem from so many different angles through different capacities. And that's one way to, or yeah, maybe that's the only way to make an impact in the education space. So I would say the core principle is working together. And then perhaps the other one I would say is, in order for an NGO to be successful in any field, we have to have very strong foundational institutional capacity. And that's what we have been trying to do for the last 3 years since our inception. That how do we develop a leadership team, executive level team, and as well as our support system, so that the institution can be sustainable, institution can be bulletproof when it comes to financial issues, as well as the institution can be operate in a direction that everybody is looking at the same direction. And so I think the institutional capacity is also an important core principle that we need to develop, and is still sort of developing as we go.
Hmm. I mean, you already partly answered my next question about challenges, because having this many stakeholders and the mindsets of all these stakeholders is very different, right?
Right.
Like ministry wants regulatory compliance, then parents want the best education. I don't know. I'm just thinking. I'm not further from the education sector, right? But and you mentioned your core principle is also like, how can you work together with all of them at the same time? So how do you do it then? Because it's like I see a lot of different people with different thinking and different mindsets, and if
Right.
you put them in a single room, it's basically going to be very hard, right? Because they all have a different expectation from you.
That's right. I mean, everybody has a different expectation, and everybody wants to do a little bit differently than one another. And I guess perhaps a third core principle is that how do we stay true to our mission and cause?
Hmm.
Because whenever you talk to different people and different stakeholders, they always wanted to tweak what you're doing in their own favor, and then or based on their own biases. So I guess the third principle is that we have to have this moral compass. That is basically we have to stay true to our mission, regardless of who say what. We have to have this sort of guiding principles that will make us stay true to our principles. In terms of challenges, you are absolutely right. People have different expectation, and people have a different perspective, and also people have different biases towards education. And most of the time people look at the problems only from their perspective, unfortunately. And that's why it's very hard sometimes convince some people. But then again, since you are working in this space where there are so many different stakeholders, you have to convince them. You have to, try to change their mindset, or at least you have to try make them understand. Hey, can you look at this problem from our angle, or can you look at this problem from maybe teacher's angle, or can you look at this problem from school principal's angle, or can you look at this problem from a community angle? So if everyone is able to see the problem from different angles, I think it would be much easier. Uh,
Hmm.
but then to do that, you need to do a lot of convincing, a lot of meetings, a lot of consensus building exercise, as well as it will take time. And I often tell my people, my staff and our board members, that we are trying to develop a solution for this huge education space, and obviously we won't be successful in the first 1, 2, 3 years, but we have to be persistent. And then in the long run, we're always looking at the long run, right? We're not necessarily looking for quick, short run wins, but we also, most of the time, looking at the long runs and how do we keep this thing going on in the next 10, 15 years.
Hmm. The education system right now is, I don't know how old it is. It's using the same logic, right? So education system, if you make a big change in education, I think it's going to be maybe more than 10, 15 years as well, right? I think so.
Exactly.
um, because education is also like very similar to medical, so it's very hard to get in, but if you get in and make a good change,
Yeah.
it becomes very easy, right? I mean, look at the example of Khan Academy.
Hmm.
It's something very simple, right? I mean, it but it solves so many people's problems. Like people can do courses there, and then Coursera came in, then there was other companies
Exactly.
as well coming in. Now you see, look at all the top universities, University of Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, all of them have online education as well. Because, for example, you want to learn something new, you do, but you cannot fly in because one, you have a job, your still job and family, so they let you study from far away, right? So it's basically changing, and I don't think that's going away so soon. It's actually getting more and more also in the market.
Yeah, exactly. To make a long lasting impact and long lasting impact that continues, you have to start from the very basic foundations, and you have to build a trust among your team members. You have to build a reputation of your institution. So I always say that the first 3 years of Teach for Mongolia was basically our inception period. It was basically we are trying so many different things and getting to know the space itself. But now we are sort of moving into starting this year. We are trying to move into sort of scaling what we have sort of tried in the last 3 years. But that does not mean improvement is not going to happen. We always have to find a way to improve ourselves, and then trust the process that we are basically doing in the long term.
Mhm. You said it's almost been 3 years now, right? 2022 you said you started it,
Yes.
so almost 3 years. So 3 years with a lot of ups and downs and downs and ups. So would love to hear, like, what was like a success story or something where you felt, you know what, we are on the right track, we are doing something really good that's actually making a measurable impact on, for example, students, teacher, communities, and also maybe the government.
In order to measure the success, or in order to measure any initiatives that we are doing in the education sector, you always have to look at the long-term impact. But then again, we can't just wait for the long-term impact to happen. We always have to sort of deliver some sort of short-term results, success stories to our donors, to our fellows, and to our board members, and etc. But we often hire people often ask me, "Hey, why would someone wants to join Teach for Mongolia and go to rural communities for 2 years when they can actually work in a corporate environment for 2 years, which with much better salaries?" And I often told them, we are basically recruiting people who have purpose, passion in mind, and they wanted to do a positive impact through an education system in rural communities that we are serving. Without that passion, without that purpose, it would be really hard to retain that person in that community for the duration of 2 years. And then people often ask us as well, "Hey, what's the retention ratio? What's the attrition ratio of your fellows?" Because I imagine living in a rural community might be quite tough and challenging because of the limited infrastructure, economic development, and all that. And then our attrition ratio is pretty high, actually. And again, I always link that to our hiring and recruiting process because we hire people based on their compassion, based on their purpose, not necessarily based on their quality. Once people have this compassion and once people have this purpose that they actually wanted to make something positive in that community, regardless of how much challenge, regardless of how much hardship they face, they're likely to overcome that. So that's an important lesson that we have learned over the last few years for us as well.
Mongolia is also a developing country, right? I don't know where does it fall on the
Yeah,
chart. Like, I think it's
it's an
developing.
upper middle. I think some lower middle income country basically. And in terms of the success stories that we have seen over the last few years, basically there are numerous success stories, and one of them I can tell you is that, for example, when one of our teachers who are compassionate, purpose driven, mission driven. I think the way they deliver their class or way they manage the class is different than just a random people who are teaching. And because they wanted to spark the interest of the students in the classroom, they don't want to just preach what's that or what's one plus one is equals to two. They also wanted to spark the interest of their students, and because of that, in numerous schools, we have seen the attendance increasing in our fellows classroom. One of our actually a fellow told me that one of the students never showed up in class, and because of her teaching, basically, student decided to come to the class, and then the student came to the class without any books or without any notebooks and pen and pencil. And then next week, that student came with a pen, pencil, and book, and etc. So it's just basically very powerful that when someone has this mission, when someone has this commitment to make an actual impact, they
Mm,
will always find a way to address, they would always find a way to deliver results, regardless of the number of students. It could be one student, two students, or an entire classroom. And that's that. And another success story that I often sort of very proudly tell people is that about half of our fellows have non-teaching backgrounds. So they are basically people with different backgrounds. So, for example, people with economics background, people with
mm,
sociology background, people with an IT background. They go there to teach math, civics, as well as maybe in computer and IT and etc. And their quality is very top notch. And because every provinces in Mongolia, as well as in a nationwide, they do this competition, what we call an Olympiad in their respective subjects. And what we have seen over the last couple of years is that our teachers perform most of the time better than those who are have a teaching background. So again, this also is a testament to our recruitment, a testament to our fellows' ability to deliver results on the ground.
mm. Now, now you mentioned one thing about the first success story, right? So these are special people. Like in my university, also there was one professor. People just went to his class to listen to him, like not
Mm,
even enrolled in the course. So I remember once I went to his class. Normally 100 people could sit in the room. It was so full that there was no place to even stand. He was that good.
right.
I was studying from another professor. He was also very good, but the way he delivered, right, was so different. And he was very strict, like very, very strict. But he was one of the coolest teachers, like really, really good. So I think people like these sometimes initiatives like Teach from Mongolia need to help people who are in the corporate sector find also like they can also teach, because they
Right.
have this hidden talent that they can teach people. So I think it's also helping people find the purpose. That's my opinion. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I
That's
think maybe she was
yeah.
doing something else completely, right?
I agree with you totally because when I was both undergrad and grad student, I often find lecturers with actually experience in banking, finance, and policy than those professors who have more of a theory-based approach, right? Because when you have a lecturer who has worked in 20 years in banking, for example, they know what are the exact challenges and what are the specific solutions that they come up with, right? And if you are being taught by someone who worked in, for example, transportation industry for their entire career, and now they are teaching, their wisdom is mostly different than those who have spent maybe their entire life in academia. And I sort of completely agree with you that I also found those who have an actual experience in their relative fields make their class, make their subjects more interesting because it's always a real life case that is very applicable to real life as opposed to a theory.
that's true. I mean, in my MBA, most of the professors, there was a balance between theory and practical. So
Right,
it was exactly what you said. So that's very true. But now you have worked in both public sector and also the private sector, right? So you have worked in top-notch organizations, and also in public sector, you have worked directly for the government, right? With the government.
right.
You would have learned something, right? Let's take this into two parts. So first, let's look at what was the most valuable insight that you gained in general, that you actually took with you and you apply it to teach for Mongolia. You say, you know what, this is a principle I learned from my corporate life, or for my working for a public sector life, and I still apply that to my current life of
Yeah,
building teach for Mongolia.
yeah. Well, I think whenever we look at different problems, right, I think one thing that I have learned both working in public and private, as well as studying, you know, public policy, I found out that one of the most useful skills for everyone to have, regardless of which industry they are working, is ability to identify problems and then find a solution for that problems. And I think that's the one skill that everybody should have. So I worked in banking and finance. Obviously, there are challenges and opportunities, but ability to identify the problem and then ability to, come up with a solution for that specific problem is often very useful. And it goes to, working in the government. It goes to working in education right now, because essentially, policy work is basically there are so many different problems, in our society, from education, from healthcare, traffic congestions, air pollution, etc. So you have to have a right solution for all these problems. And in order to find out the right solution, you have to do a lot of research. You have to talk to a lot of different people, technical experts, and maybe listening to a podcast, maybe reading books, and etc. So there's so many different ways to get an information. And once you have all these different information, how do you analyze that, right? How do you analyze the information, and as well as how do you come up with the right solution based on so many different information you gathered? I think that's one sort of, it's not just one skill, it's a set of skills that is required for everyone. And that skill has been helpful, very helpful for running Teach for Mongolia, an NGO. We're also looking at the problem in the education sector. But when you're working in an NGO, you also have to look at the problems of running an NGO, which is a not-for-profit organization. So how do you keep them, how do you keep that money coming in, even though you have no product or services to sell to a buyer? So I think that's probably one thing that I can sort of say, that having that set of skills is very important.
Mm-hmm. Now let's the same question. What leadership skill or lesson did you learn from private and public sector that you still apply in Teach for Mongolia? Because now you're on the top level, C level, right?
Right.
So you have a team to manage.
Well, I think over the years, I have had very great bosses, and I have had horrible bosses, and they all teach you something, right? The great bosses always teach you, hey, I want to be like this person when I am in that level. And the horrible bosses also teach you, I don't want to be like him or her when I'm in that level, so that, so I think both great and horrible bosses teach you something. And then I think my philosophy is that a lot of the time you can divide the leaders into two categories. One is those who wanted to lead by fear, and then second is those who wanted to lead by respect. When I talk about the by fear, it's always that people are afraid of them, of the first type of leader who lead by fear. And then second one is also people who are, I guess you can say, lead by respect, because people who are working under him or her is always wanted to deliver results, first of all, and then work in line because they have so much respect for the leaders that they are working for. So I guess my type of leadership is basically, again, how do I become a leader in my organization or in my community where people are respect not necessarily me as an individual, but respect or maybe have an alignment of what I'm trying to accomplish in the long term, right? You don't have to necessarily like the sometimes an individual that you work with, but when you have a vision and when you have this long-term goal that is aligned with that particular leader, I think it
Mm.
makes life much more easier for everyone.
Mm. So my career was very good, right? So I had till a certain point, like a lot of years, I never had a bad manager. Never. Always I was privileged, so to say, like very lucky to
Yeah,
always have good managers, like who I would be like, he's a smart guy, he or she's a smart person, knows how to talk with people, takes care of my problems, helps me figure them out, and then is someone I do learn from, at the end of the day.
right.
So, and I would like to steal this attribute from them and incorporate that into my own life. But then I remember once I got a manager, and that was the worst experience of my life. Like,
Yeah,
this guy had all red flags you can imagine. He was shouting at his team, he was yelling at his team, like
yeah.
swearing at them all the time, like unreasonable expectations and so on. That was my first encounter, and it was brutal that I ended up leaving him within literally a few months. Like within a few months, I said no. I'm done. I cannot take this anymore. I don't want to, like, I don't want to be
Yeah,
like I don't want to have so much negative impact on my
exactly.
life.
And another thing I sort of observed over the years is that a lot of the managers and leaders wanted to basically they wanted to keep the employees with them forever, and I don't think that's a realistic goal because especially nowadays, on average, people, especially the Gen Zs or young professionals, they wanted to work in an environment maybe 2 to 3 years and they wanted to move on to the next thing because that has become the norm these days, right? Not it's not like back in the 70s, 80s where people start their career in one organization and retire in that organization after 40 years. So I think we have to, as a managers, have to be realistic about that assumption as well. So I always encourage people who work for me, when are you going to leave me, basically? When are you going to leave this organization? But when you leave, you always have to leave for the next phase, or how can I be the stepping stone for your next career trajectory for yourself, whether it's higher position or whether it's a different industry or even if it's maybe a grad school getting a scholarship and etc. So I always sort of uh, urge them, hey, you've been working with me 2 3 years now, are you looking at the grad school now, are you looking at getting ready for your applications or etc. So I think that sort of encouragement as well as becoming a stepping stone for people who are working under you for the next success is often a very rewarding experience for both who are working for you as well as for me. And I often
Mhm.
get this unsolicited messages from them, hey, you helped me with this application or you helped me to write this, you provided me to write this recommendation which was very helpful, now I'm doing this and that. So it's always good to see people who worked with is doing better in a different space. So I think that's also one thing that I have learned, which is very important for
Mhm.
both leaders as well as for those who are working under you.
Mhm. And that feels good, right? When you get like a random message from one of your persons who was reporting to you and says, "Hey, you know what? I just want to write you. How are you doing? And thank you." And they tell you that what they are doing,
Exactly.
and you feel good, right? You feel really nice.
Definitely.
I just got a message email like I think I got it this week. I think on Tuesday or something from one of the ladies. She just told me she started doing her masters in AI.
Hmm.
So she basically was a computer scientist, a bachelor's in computer science, and then she ended up working with me. And she was like, I sort of like told her that, hey, I'm building this new product, and it's hard for me to find someone who can actually manage the product because it's a very, very technical product.
Right.
So I think you would be a good person for this. She was like, but this is not coding. I'm like, I know you can code as well. I don't mind that. But I would suggest that you manage this project for me,
Yeah.
because I don't have the capacity, I don't have the time. So it would be good. And it was an AI application. So she did that, and she basically liked the whole, like, how AI works and so on. And then she ended up doing a master's, which I just learned. I was like, oh, that's so awesome. So those messages are really like, they're like the best messages you can
Right.
get any day.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally agree with you there.
Now you're involved in a lot of mentoring as well, right? Like do you go also and teach? Like that's a little out of the box.
I do not personally teach. What I often do is basically, as you mentioned, running the organization, setting the long-term strategies, and making sure there's money in the bank. I think as a CEO of an NGO, I think that's probably the biggest contribution you can do, is making sure that there's money in the bank. So making sure that you pay your salaries on time. So that's very important task that I have to do, and also taking care of my people, so that when I'm taking care of my people, they can take care of our fellows and teachers, and then teachers and fellows can take care of the students. So sort of this cascade approach.
Mm-hmm. But you still mentor and develop the next generation of leaders,
Right.
right? Like one of my mentors said this to me, Majid, remember, whenever you become a leader, think about you're building the next generation. So how do you and mentor and develop like the next generation of Mongolian leaders, whether through Teach for Mongolia or other initiatives where people just send you a message? They are also from Mongolia. They send you a message on LinkedIn and they ask you a question or advice, right?
Yeah. Well, I think right now we are focused on. So we do this. What's our desired student impact or student outcome? There are a couple of them, and I would very much like to focus on a couple of things that are. One is being ability to think critically for students through young professionals, and then being ability to work together or in teams. That's also a very important skills that people need to develop from a very young age. And then again, going back to what I just mentioned before, being a solution oriented as opposed to, you know, because when you meet with people who are not solution oriented, they often complain, they're very pessimistic about the state of the future, they're pessimistic about anything that, comes to life throws at them. So I think being a solution oriented is always often a key as well. So having this mindset of this is the problem and I can solve it or we can solve it together. And then again, going back to what I just mentioned, how do we solve it? How do we find a solution? How do we work together? And also, this problem looks like this from my angle, but perhaps maybe if we change the angle and perspective, how would that look? Having that empathy is also very important. So whenever I mentor, as well as whenever we try to do uh, on the ground, is on top of the academic performance, we also wanted our students to have these key skills, which is think critically, work together, and be solution oriented, and be able to take care of yourself. That means both mentally and physically.
Mm-hmm. I mean, working together is also internally the organization is also like you before mentioned, like with stakeholders, right?
Right.
And it's not easy to work with this big diverse sort of stakeholders. So, would love to understand of a success story or a successful collaboration that basically for Teach for Mongolia that you did between business, maybe non-profit, uh, any other stakeholders, if you can name them also.
Sure. So, starting last year, we are implementing, on top of what we are doing, we are implementing a climate education project in Mongolia, in cooperation with international organizations as well as local corporates and our teachers and our students on the ground. And when I say climate education, why is it important to Mongolia specifically? I mean, if you look at Mongolia, We are a nomadic culture. We have very long history, and even today, there are a big chunk of our population who are reliant on agriculture, especially livestock herding. So when there is an extreme weather events like extreme winter or drought or inability to secure water resources, it all affects their way of life. Because when you have livestock, basically you have to move from one place to another place to find better pasture, better water, find a place that is a little warmer during the winter, and etc. So that's why Mongolians or nomadic people often move because of their way of lives, because the livestock sort of dictates their lives as opposed to they are dictating their own life. And then it has a huge social and economic impact because whenever there is an extreme winter, those herders often lose a big chunk of their livestock, whether it's sheep, cow, goats, right? And that's basically their commodity to live and survive the next day. And when you lose
Mhm.
that livestock, what happens is they often go to central area. They move to central area. They live in the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city of Mongolia. They live in a place what we call the Ger districts, which often do not have running water, poor infrastructure, and etc. So their life becomes a completely different. So we have introduced this climate education we have introduced this climate education initiative in our schools that we are partnering because we want our students to understand the importance of preserving, protecting the nature. At the same time, how do we adapt in this changing, climate
Mhm.
scenarios so that even if there is a harsh winter, or even if there is a drought, or even if there is not enough water, they can sort of think about a solution and how to cope with it and how to adapt in this different, ever changing environment. And so we wanted to make sure that students have this understanding from very early on, and then they can come up with their own small solution and a community-based solution, and then they can implement that. So that has been sort of going back to what we talked about very initially, guiding principles, right? How do we work together? How do we find a problem, and then how do we apply that solution to a real life scenario? So that's what we are doing, and it has been very successful. And our students are very eager because when you are just teaching and preaching them something in a classroom, it's different. But when you ask them to be a leader themselves and find a solution or find a problem and find a solution, and why don't you implement it? And here is the initial seed fund that you can have. So they come up with so many different ideas that we have not even thought about before. And now they, along with their teachers, they're implementing it. And probably next month, we're going to have sort of showcasing symposium by all the students that participated in the project, and I think that's it's a very a great story for all of us.
I mean, give me like the link or something, so I would happily put it so people can also read about it more.
I will,
And
yes.
I wish you all the best for that. By the way, it's a super good thing because I think it's climate is also a very important topic we need to address as well. Small things do make a big impact. So small initiatives, like, and you're combining both, like education, a problem exists, and climate, the problem exists. So when you combine both of them, that's actually tackling two birds with one stone, right? So you're trying to solve two problems. So now I would love to understand, because this is a country's future, right? So we have, for example, education is one sector, right? So what innovations do you think in education, technology, or finance do you actually believe that will help Mongolia's development, like future development, be faster and also be in pace with the other countries with the sort of competitive edge, right?
The answer is in twofold. One is a human development. We have to make sure that our people, meaning our students, young professionals, as well as the general population, they need to have ability to adapt in a different, ever-changing environment, specifically with the technology, because technology is changing quite rapidly, and everything that we do, and our day-to-day life is hugely impacted by the changes in technology, both positive and negative ways. Right? The social media wasn't around 20 years ago. When I was a student, we did not have a social media, but right now social media is making a huge impact, in not just in Mongolia but across the globe. And now, when we were in Davos, I think AI was one of the dominant topics, right? The wave of AI, and how do we sort of keep the pace with this new development? How do we become the forefront leader of AI? As well as how do we sort of adapt to this in environment? And I think because of the ever-changing technology we've seen in the last couple of years, there are so many, I guess, jobs as well as skills are becoming an obsolete, right? Because the machines can do it. And when you are in a developing country like in Mongolia, I truly believe that human capital is very essential to develop, and then keep up with this new trends. One thing that I have not mentioned is that Mongolia, when we look at the economy right now, it's very heavily reliant on mining commodities. So Mongolia is a huge exporter of coal, copper, and gold. About 90% of our exports are mining related products, and as well as 90% of our exports go to one country, which is China. So, which makes us very susceptible to an external shocks. So, when there is a price change in a mining commodity, our economy would sort of negatively impact it, etc. So, in order for us to avoid these type of what we call a mining cycle, economic cycle, I truly believe that we have to invest in our human development capacity, basically,
Mm.
uh, develop our people from young age, so that they can find a different solutions to the problems, as well as find a different innovative solutions to sort of diversify our economy, so that we don't become heavily reliant on one industry or one sector or even one country.
I didn't know that the 90% of the export are to China. That's a new fact for me as well. But that's true than what you mentioned. Um, but then now, because I just realized that we are also coming more towards an end. I have two final questions. One is, for example, I am a Pakistani guy. I live in Germany, so I'm an expat here. I mean, I try to support as many initiatives as I can, whatever is possible for me. I am sure there would be also people from Mongolia who are sitting outside. They studied abroad, or they ended up working abroad and calling another city home because they settled in there. I mean, that happens, right? So, and these are people who really want to also. Sometimes they're like, you know what, I grew up there and I would love to also support or somehow be a part of, the value chain and like the development there. So, how can people, like, for example, myself, if I was Mongolian, listening to the podcast, actually also contribute to Teach for Mongolia?
Yeah. There's definitely a huge space for them to contribute, and there's so many different ways. So I often ask, whenever I go to an event, whenever I talk to potential donors, I ask three things basically. One is time. If you have a time, give us your time, be a volunteer, help us on things that you are good at, because some people might be very good lawyers, so they can help us with some contracts. Some people could be very good, maybe a financier who can help us to, you know maintain our books and finance and etc. So I think time is one thing that I often ask. And then the other thing is, again, treasure, which is, hey, in order to run a NGO, we always need a potential fund. We need the money to run, so that we can implement what we are trying to do in the Mongolian education sector. And third thing is very easy. You may not have a time, you may not have a money, but third is tell. Please tell our stories to your surroundings, so that more people aware of what we're doing in Mongolia, what we're doing in the education sector, and potentially those people can help come in and help us both in terms of money or in terms of dedicating their time. So basically, again, to sum it up, time, treasure, and tell our stories. That's a very simple thing.
Mm,
Anyone can sort of do.
mm. Yeah, that's nicely put. I mean, very nicely put. I'm probably going to use that, like, three words:
Yeah,
uh, time dot, time dot treasure dot share or tell. So it's
tell our
basically
stories. Yes,
tell the right. So it basically amplifies the message that, okay,
exactly,
people might know someone that can actually finance the project for some time or something, or people might know someone like a lawyer or something who can actually help, like you mentioned as well.
exactly.
But my final question is more towards, what are the big plans for Teach for Mongolia? Like, some exciting new things that you want to tell people, to excite the people, like tell them, like, look, this is the fancy thing we are working on.
Sure. Again, the fancy thing that we are gonna, the climate education was one of the fancy thing. We also have just introduced, we have introduced a rural school leadership program. So the idea of the rural school leadership is that whenever we send fellow teachers in the rural schools, we have to work with the principals, we have the manager of that school, basically the leadership team. And that leadership team has to be on the same page as our fellows, as us, and etc. So how do we make them all these different stakeholders on the same page? So we have introduced this program again. So climate education, that, and I think going forward, again, we are definitely thinking about other opportunities, specifically in financial literacy, digital literacy, which is becoming an essential, because the finance is a huge part of everyone's life, and we don't teach enough when they're in school, when they're in maybe even a student, in a college students, right? So how do we make sure that students, when they are in a school, have a basic understanding of what is finance, what is deposits, right? Why is it important to investing? Why is it important to bookkeeping? Those are the skills that they need to acquire when they're school students. The other thing is digital literacy. Again, as I mentioned, as the technology is developing so fast and AI and everything, students needs to sort of have the basic ability to use technology, use computer. So those are the things that we are also looking at on the horizon. And I think the third thing that I'd like to, something that I'm very passionate about is how do we empower boys in Mongolia? That is something that I have been sort of thinking about for the last 3 years, and I'm still trying to implement some sort of project in that specific area. Because when you look at Mongolia, or the percentage of gender ratio between men or the boys and girls is almost 50%. But when you look at the percentage of gender, the gender ratio when they're an undergrad, it's about 60-40 in favor of girls. Basically, more girls go to college. And if you go to master's degree, it's even higher, maybe 80-20. And if you got PhD students, it's maybe a 90-10. So each level goes up. As it goes up, the number of boys, the number of men is decreasing significantly. And it's, there are a number of reasons, but there's also a cultural factor that it plays in a role. So I think empowering boys, and especially in rural areas, is something that needs to happen. And we are definitely very much looking into that area as well.
It's very new for me. Normally, it's the other way around, right? That the
Right.
countries are trying to get more ladies to get into domains, but that's interesting. I mean, I didn't know that. The
Yeah.
population you said is 50-50. It's almost 50-50.
It's almost 50-50. So again, it goes back to different, different countries has a different context, different cultural
Mm,
background. They have a different mindset. But right now, for Mongolia, girls, I think, are in mostly an advantaged position. But that does not mean I wanted to reduce the advantage for the girls, but there needs to be an equal positive message towards the boys as well. Unfortunately, that is missing at the
mm,
moment, and I think Teach for Mongolia wants to be the voice for that uh,
mm,
message as well.
mm. I think you also are. We need to keep the point that you're increasing the number of education possibilities as well, right? So
Right.
maybe that already increases the number of education possibilities for boys as well. But with that, I would like to thank you for joining in today. This was actually very different, so to say, because I've never been to Mongolia. I do not know much about the country because it's a you don't study, like we never studied about anything about Mongolia. Not gonna lie, but it was when I met you at Davos was super cool, and when we talked through the podcast, it was super cool. So, as a final question, is there something you would like to share as a closing remark with anyone who stayed till this point?
Well, I guess first of all, thank you very much for your time and ability. Allow me to come to your podcast and sharing what we are doing in Mongolia. Um, I think, again, as I mentioned, you are definitely helping us with your time as well as giving me a platform to spread around what we are doing in Mongolia. Uh, so definitely thank you for that. I think the final thought is that whoever listening to this podcast, there's a number of ways you can be involved in the causes that you care about, right? Or helping the NGOs, helping the causes and activities and etc. And then I think it doesn't have to be Teach for Mongolia, but it could be an organization that you wanted to support in Pakistan, for example. But a lot of the people think that, well, since I'm not in Pakistan or since I'm not in Mongolia, maybe there's no way for me to help. But again, as I mentioned, you can always dedicate time. You can always send some money, or you can always tell their stories. So be mindful of that and support the causes that you truly care about, and it means a lot to a lot of the NGOs, especially in the developing countries.
Mm, true. I mean, very true. Like if I just tell people send in 50 euros, 50 euros here, it's not that much. But when you send it to Pakistan, it becomes suddenly like 15,000 rupees, which is still good money where you can,
Yeah,
a decent family can sustain something, buy groceries and so on. But 50 euros here is if you go to a restaurant, I mean, Davos was even more expensive than you told me, right?
exactly.
So like 50 euros would be a meal for one person. So, but well, thank you so much again. This was very good. So, to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into the executives this week. If you found this episode valuable, want to learn more about Teach for Mongolia, go visit the links, they would be mentioned. And do not forget to subscribe, share, and also comment on the video because that helps also us share initiatives like this and also to get the word out. Maybe you have time, maybe you can give some financial support, or maybe you can just share the story, like Tushik said. So until next time, this is Majid signing off.